What's up, y'all? Just another video real quick on Europe and the Middle Ages. Lots of interesting things going on in the Middle Ages, and plan to talk to y'all a little bit about what the Middle Ages really were. This is just a short overview. It's nothing too deep into the subject, but just an overview of kind of what the Middle Ages are about and some things that kind of get this thing started. So, yes, you do see a leprechaun there. You do see a monk, a knight, and a guy that's holding a church building that was made for ants. So, just kidding, that's not what that is, but we'll talk about it. Anyway, so Europe and the Middle Ages. So let's start with Europe. What is Europe? Basically, Europe is a continent that most of y'all are familiar with. It's where we have spent a majority of this class in. You can think of places like Rome, Greece, the empire as a whole, the expansion of Rome, the Germanic tribes, the barbarians that came and basically destroyed Rome. That's kind of what we focused on, but we're going to kind of talk about what happens after Rome falls. So anyways, what's Europe? It's basically a huge landmass, a continent that pretty much probably has more influence in the way you and I live our lives than probably any other place in the world. But most of us have a lot of European influence in our life. So anyways, Middle Ages is not only going to impact just Europe, but Eurasia. And Eurasia is basically a large landmass that makes up Europe and part of Asia. It starts to trickle in towards the Middle East and a little bit beyond that. But Europe's very diverse geographically. You've got tons of mountains like the Alps that are just north of Italy, the Balkans, which are in Eastern Europe around Greece, and then not to mention the Pyrenees, which are kind of a dividing area between modern-day Spain and France. And then rivers. You got the Seine, the Rhine, the Danube. Many, as you can see, that kind of divide out these modern-day countries of Europe in this picture here. And then you have peninsulas that branch out into several oceans. And honestly, you can start looking at which peninsula might be the largest. You might say the Iberian Peninsula. The Scandinavian Shield is pretty big. The Italian Peninsula, the Greek Peninsula. Tons of peninsulas that branch out, making it a great place for trade, expansion of ideas, right? Interaction with people. So Europe, this is what we're focusing on. This area in green on this map here, this is really what we're looking at for this unit of study. So looking at this photo, all right, I want you just to kind of reflect for a second. Something's going on. We've seen several photos that have landscape that looks like this and, architecture like this. And most of y'all, when you see these photos, you instantly jump to, oh, this got to be Rome. And that's what this is. This is a famous painting by, I believe, an artist in the 19th century, maybe. I think it's the 19th century. I may be wrong, so don't hold me to that. His name's Thomas Cole, and it's called Destruction. And guess what he's painting the destruction of? That is the destruction of Rome. So thinking about Rome and where the Roman Empire once stood, I know it's been several months since we've been learning about Rome, but I want you to think how this could impact Europe. They literally had taken over almost all of Europe. And I mean, pretty impressive feat. And they had built roads, they had maintained armies, governing laws over the land, and now that's gone. So how can that impact Europe? Well, many of y'all say, well, there was so much social order, there was so much political order and law in order that, Europe's kind of up for grabs, do what you want. And that's kind of where the Middle Ages is going. There was so much structure for so long, and now that's gone. So it becomes what we call a power vacuum, where there is something that's waiting to be taken over. Usually there's chaos. So there's going to be a little bit of a power vacuum. And the Middle Ages really start with the fall of Rome. So Europe after the fall of Rome. This is a map of Europe circa AD 500 CE, whichever way you want to say that, that's fine. But you'll notice you have different groups that have taken over different parts of Europe. So you'll notice most of Western Europe's been taken over. The former Byzantine Empire is still standing strong, but we're now in this time known as the Middle Ages. So as Rome falls, tribes begin moving into these Roman lands. And as they move in, they're going to create their own groups, their own kingdoms. And these kingdoms are not going to get along, y'all. They're just not. And that's part of the power vacuum that I mentioned just a second ago. These kingdoms will begin to fight. So Rome falls in AD 476, I have here, yeah. And then by 500, Europe is pretty much absolutely covered. In about 14, 15 years, it's absolutely covered in small kingdoms all throughout Europe. And we know this time as the Middle Ages because it falls in the middle of a very distinct time frame. On one side, you have Rome, the Roman Empire, which had lasted, from the fall of, Julius Caesar in 44 BC or BCE. He's killed on the Ides of March, and basically the Roman Empire is formed from that. From that point up until, this time, Middle Ages start. And then after the Middle Ages, you have another term, another era known as the Renaissance. And what the Renaissance was, it was a rebirth in Roman and Greek thinking. So, yeah, a lot of how we live our lives is heavily attributed to Rome and Greece. That's why we spend so much time talking about them and learning about them in class. Not that we're not impacted by other groups, Asian civilizations play a huge role, African civilizations, Mesoamerican civilizations, but a lot of the way we live our lives in the United States is heavily focused around European thinking. So we spend a lot of time talking about that along with the others, but mainly European ideology. So the Middle Ages falls between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. All right. So here's what's really going to happen. During the Middle Ages, the main driving force of what's going to take over all relates to Christianity. Okay, Christianity is going to be the driving force in a lot of things going on in Europe. So in the beginning of the Middle Ages, many kingdoms in Northern Europe were not Christian. They were actually pagan, which means basically they had beliefs in polytheistic religions that were seen as kind of tribal, not logically created. That's kind of the way they live their lives. Pagan, they were seen as outsiders backwards by, Christian and Muslim believers, and other groups as well. But anyways, with time, Christianity is going to grow and prosper. All right. It slowly spreads north, and the main reason why is because of missionaries and monks. And what missionaries and monks were, a missionary was a person who was going out and they're trying to bring people to their religion. What monks were people who lived in missions or like churches, and they basically gave their entire life to the spreading of Christianity. They lived away from society, and they lived in their own, basically captivity, I guess you could say. They lived in their own place, usually in a church. But these people were responsible for basically spreading Christianity. One of the most famous is St. Patrick, which we actually get the term St. Patrick's Day from. And he was a notable missionary, having a lot to do with the island of Ireland. But anyways, he brought Christianity to Ireland and Britain. And you think about American heritage, or United States of America, American heritage, sorry. We start thinking about Britain. And that's why we celebrate things like St. Patrick's Day, because he was the person who brought Christianity to that region. And one thing that made him popular, as lore goes, is that he won the hearts of the Irish by getting rid of all the snakes. So if you hate snakes, you probably love this guy. Here's some great political, cartoons, I guess you could say, or newspaper cartoons. It shows him hitting a golf tee, like driving the snakes out and then driving them off a cliff. Yeah, it's great. Anyways, so also the role of monks. Monks were those who lived away from the rest of society, kind of in their own captive state of saying, you know what, I'm going to give my life solely to the spreading of the gospel of the Bible. And monks were more than just teachers. They were also people who provided health care in rural areas. Most of these churches that are going to be set up are going to be where there's a lot of green around them. It's not like in huge cities, because a lot of people who lived in cities, their ideas were so stuck in one way of life that they weren't as open to it. It's just kind of the way city life and rural life goes. So they took advantage of rural, societies trying to spread their teachings. Also, they were hospitable. They did charitable acts. They ran schools. They copied and saved, not plagiarized, but they would retranscribe. They would rewrite down ancient texts And a big reason why we have a lot of the things we have today is because of monks. So if you're thankful for history, especially European history, you need to be thankful for monks because a lot of that they wrote down. Also, they were scribes and advisors to local rulers, so they're kind of like historians. One of the biggest groups at this time, though, was known as the Franks. All right, and around the 480s, as Christianity spread, one group began to conquer Gaul. Now, y'all will remember Gaul was conquered by which famous Roman? You should be able to know that just from how much you should know about him from class. It was Julius Caesar, right? But when Rome falls, Gaul's now back up for grabs. And the group that's going to take over Gaul is going to be known as the Franks. They're mainly going to be led by a guy named Clovis, who they're going to conquer, and they will become Christians. The most famous Frank king, though, is going to be Charlemagne. It's late 1700s, or not 1700s, 700s. And he is going to lead the Franks to create a big empire. You'll see here that purple on that map. He's going to take over parts of, Switzerland, modern-day Germany, France, the Netherlands. So it's pretty impressive what he's going to lead them to do. And he was very Christian. There he is, in that picture. That's a meme. I did not make that. But he's got the Infinity Gauntlet from Avengers with all these different kingdoms he's going to take over. Pretty impressive. But anyways, Charlemagne's accomplishments on Christmas Day of the year 800. Charlemagne's going to be crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III. And a big reason why is because look what he took over. He basically took over the old Roman Empire. All right, so he is going to be considered an Emperor of the Romans. All right. During this time, though, he's going to build schools, he's going to hire scholars to teach, and he's going to make sure people are educated. When we talk Middle Ages, a lot of people start acting like people were not educated, people were backwards, people didn't practice good hygiene. Some of that's true, but it's some of the things that happen in the Middle Ages that really lead us up to modern day. Some of the first universities were actually created at this time. Higher learning was a huge focus. Not that it was a focus of everyone, but it was a big focus by some. Charlemagne also is going to shape and spread Christianity in his kingdom, making this modern day area of France, Switzerland, Germany very Christianized. Here's a palace that he's going to build, modern day Germany, in Aachen. A huge World War II battle is named after Aachen. Anyways, that's a different story for another time. But Charlemagne accomplished a lot. And then the final thing is, during this time, you have this huge power vacuum, and it only gets that much crazier when there are other groups that start to infiltrate what is happening. You got the Franks who are really taking over, and you can see other groups that are, trying to take over. Where's that map? You get the Franks and the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, some names that you are familiar with, the Anglo-Saxons. But it only gets that much crazier. One of the biggest groups that y'all know during the Middle Ages that's trying to make their footprint on the world image is the Muslims, the Muslim community. You've learned about Africa in class and what the Muslims did to spread their influence in North Africa. One group is known as the Magyars, and they are going to invade southern France and northern Italy. A lot of Muslim influence will enter into areas like that, not to mention what's going on in Spain. Also, if you go up to Scandinavia, if you look at the map there on the left, the purple, Scandinavia, that is where a lot of Vikings resided. And what made the Vikings so scary is if you look at this map of Europe here on the bottom left, you'll notice that it's covered in a lot of little blue streaks, and those are rivers. And those rivers were inlets, I guess you could say, for the Vikings to use their boats and to attack. Because what do you notice? There's a Viking boat on the right. Is it very big? There's not a lot of men on it. It's not like you're putting a, huge ocean barge or whatever you want to call it, ocean transport vessel into these small rivers. These were fast-moving machines of death that when you saw a few of these coming, you knew the Vikings were on their way to ransack your city and destroy you. The Vikings were a huge threat. So you're going to see throughout the Middle Ages, a period that lasts roughly about 1,000 years. It's going to be a time of lots of back and forth in terms of who's in power. It's going to be a time in which Christianity is going to spread rampantly. And a big reason why many of you in your life might claim Christian heritage is because of what happened in the Middle Ages. It's also going to be a time in which, I guess you could say, ideas will be preserved, but a lot of people will lose that literacy and will lose the good practices of hygiene. It's going to be a time in which the world seems like it's taking a step back for many, but for some, it's progressing. And you'll see that to hold true when you start learning about the Renaissance next year, just how much we owe to the Middle Ages. People talk about, like, they call it the Dark Ages because things kind of went down compared to where they were when Rome was, in power. But, you got to realize a lot of these people who were invading the Roman Empire, they had a different lifestyle. And this is just kind of a view into how that was. So, Middle Ages took a long time throughout history. A lot of spreading of new ideas. Christianity is going to be introduced. And then you're going to have a huge power vacuum in which people are constantly competing for power. But anyways, hopefully this gives you a little oversight into what's going to go down during the Middle Ages. I appreciate your attention. Hope y'all have a great day and keep being awesome.